Do you feel politically homeless?
Join the club.
Both parties are becoming more tribal, and neither fully represent the values of Jesus. Christians need a path forward that leaves partisanship behind.
That's why we wrote Truth Over Tribe, pledging allegiance to the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant. Together, we can end tribalism.
Pre-order the book on Amazon, and let's start a movement.
Because I realize for a lot of listeners, this is going to start sounding really unsophisticated. Okay, we're having a weird conversation today, aren't we? Like, this is the campfire conversation at Bible camp where people tell their demon stories. And that's not what we're doing. But I want to get back to that in just a second. Yeah. But if I'm hearing you correctly, it's that, yes, they understood what unified Rome, for example, as a goddess, as a divine being, and perhaps what unified all of these different groups as being divine powers, which unified those separate groups. And by bringing those groups together was a way of saying to those powers, no, you aren't in control of any of these people who fall into your various tribes, into your various allegiances. They have a higher allegiance, which is unifying them and which transcends your authority. And so it's a way of saying to Roma, you aren't chief. You aren't in charge. There's someone else in charge here right now, and that's Jesus. And you can tell because those people shouldn't be cavorting about with the slaves. They shouldn't be cavorting about with the Gentiles or the Jews or whoever else. They shouldn't be around.
Yep. Yeah. No. Yeah. That's right. So maybe two parables or word pictures here. So one of them would be for that last point you were just making. So actually, this is dangerous territory because I'm not an NFL. Okay, this is how much of a sports fan I am not.
NFL, National Football something.
I was thinking of basketball, so I think that's the NBA. Yeah. That's the NBA. So imagine a bunch of NBA players get so fed up with the league and how the teams are organized that like there's this upstart league that just begins on the side, and they have a new coach, and people begin to play in addition for this other team on the side. And you have people from like rival teams, but now they're joining this alternate league, and they're playing together, and they're practicing together, they're eating together. And when they go back out on the court in the NBA, their relationships to each other are defined by the powers that be over the NBA. But when they go, on Wednesday nights and join the alternate league, who they are to each other in the NBA, it's completely irrelevant. And what they want to do is actually turn this Wednesday night league into the real game. Like that. That's essentially how Paul imagines is that the long-awaited deliverer of the people of Israel, who Paul and lots of early Jewish followers of Jesus believe that's who Jesus was, believe that he, through his suffering and death for the failures of his own people and for the nations, was an act of God's own suffering love to take the train wreck of human history and the way we divide ourselves up into categories and then kill and oppress each other. That all of that death and isolation and pain was channeled into one representative death of Jesus on the cross. And that the resurrection of Jesus was the triumph of God's love and the launch of a new league. And so to join the Wednesday night league is and Paul's dream for these house churches was that who they were to each other on Wednesday nights would begin to change them in such a way that they would actually go back into the NBA and start to just say, why are we rivals anyway? Like, we serve the same coach on Wednesday nights, so like maybe this whole system is designed in a way that's just hopelessly corrupt, and maybe we just need to learn to be on a different team together. So that's one parable.
Yeah.
The other parable is, I get it, and I similarly have a difficult time embracing this multi-dimensional reality of powers, invisible powers or spiritual powers. But I would submit that the world that we inhabit in the modern West, we are so in the legacy of the ancient Roman Empire. When I went to go do my PhD studies in the University of Madison, Wisconsin. Madison had a Jewish studies department there.
Yeah.
Where I studied Hebrew Bible. And it also, the big state university is in the same downtown as the state capital of Wisconsin. And I grew up in Portland, Oregon. The state capital is like an hour south. And I'd gone like for a school field trip or something. But in Madison, it was like down the street. And so I would regularly walk through the Capitol because sometimes it was shorter to walk through it than around it.
Your Capitol shortcut.
Yeah, totally. And so I'll never forget the day I looked up in the rotunda, you know, the big central area, and I saw facing the 4 points of the compass, like these state values like liberty, justice. I forget what the other two were, but I remember liberty and justice.
You can fill it in with whatever you want.
Yeah, right. But they weren't spelled in English. They were spelled in Latin. And
the language of ancient Rome.
And each of the four plaques had like a human statue over it. And one day I was like, what's that about? And so I went and looked it up, and it's like, this is in almost all U.S. state capitals.
Yeah.
And they're modernized forms of ancient Greek gods.
Yeah. Well, you're making me think of in the U.S., in our national capital, there's this painting in the rotunda of George Washington. It's called the apotheosis of Washington, which is a old word for when a human becomes a divine being. So like Caesar dies and then he becomes a divine being, and he's there ruling over heaven on the clouds with justice and virtue and all these other figures alongside him. It's the exact same thing.
The only difference between us and, the people of Paul the Apostle's day is that we don't attribute a individual personality to those. What we call them today are ideals or ideologies, depending on your point of view. But very much these control our imaginations. They structure the built environment of our neighborhoods, of our cities, and of our lives and our calendars and our budgets and bank accounts. They structure our lives. So that's what Paul is referring to when he refers to the principalities and powers. It just so happens he believed that there was another layer of reality to these that moderns find very difficult to swallow. And I get that. I struggle with that too. So let's at least say what he's naming is the same reality that we live in today. And it may be that he's naive about thinking there's some personal invisible reality, or it could be that we have just an impoverished view of reality and that we have something to learn from the wisdom of the ancients. But that's maybe a whole other conversation. My point is that those are the powers that Paul says when a group of people get together who outside of the Jesus gathering ought to be like put into organized in their different tribes, whether because the social environment says so or because they've chosen it. And when people gather and actually make meaningful relationships and eat together and worship the one risen Jesus together, that will begin, that communicates to the powers that their time is up. That's how Paul sees the world. And you can read his letters to the Corinthians, to the Roman churches, to the Colossian churches, and it's all the same. It's just all the same thing. I think it's because we don't know how to inhabit Paul's imagination when we read these letters, that we just kind of screen a lot of this stuff out. But for me, it's been a profound discovery about not just the ancient world, the Bible, but about giving me a new set of glasses to see my world, so that when we come to the first question that you asked that we still haven't gotten towards,
we'll get there,
is that for me, all of this has been hugely influential for how I think about the fragmentation, cultural, social, or otherwise, in my own environment.
Before we get there, I'm just making sure I'm tracking with you. The powers and principalities that Paul spoke about in his time, it might have been Rome, it might have been your mercantile guild, it might have been a whole litany of things that functioned as the powers, the principalities, which were separating people across all of these different lines. In the modern world, if I'm tracking with you, you're saying that ideologies function in the same manner. They are the powers and the principalities. Is that what you're saying, or are you saying something slightly different? I'm just trying to track with it.
Yeah, I think ideologies or ideals, but ideologies don't mean much unless there is an institutional reality to them.
That's kind of what I wanted to get at. Is there seems to be a difference between, let's say, consumerism, which is a kind of ideology, but there's, I suppose, there are institutions that are a part of that. You know, the shopping center, or Amazon.com, maybe call those the institutions which express it. But you would say more so than the institutions; those are really the powers and principalities.
Correct. The institutional embodiments of these ideals. And two things. One, just so I'm not like pulling this out of thin air. There's one really important section of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in what we call chapter 2, and he's talking. He has this line where he says, "Man, if the powers and principalities knew who they were executing when they crucified Jesus, they wouldn't have done it. If they would have known what the Jesus movement and the Spirit of God was going to unleash because of what they did to him, they probably wouldn't have. They had no clue what they were doing." That's what he says. If the powers hadn't crucified our Lord. And there's a long-standing question about, well, what does he mean? Because he was executed through the orchestration of the Jewish high priest and the high council of the people called the Sanhedrin, and then, a pushover governor, Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. And so they're the ones who actually gave the orders for his judge. But Paul uses the same word to describe the human institutional figureheads as he does on other occasions to describe invisible spiritual powers. And so the question is, are these separate things in Paul's mind, or maybe they're not different things? And have come to the persuasion, and lots of people smarter than me who I've learned from about this, that for Paul, they're not different things. And so
are they not different because the persons and the organizations or the institutions are being animated by these powers? It seems like they are different. I mean, you've described them as different things, and I can understand them as different things. So what do you mean by saying, no, they're not different?
Yeah, I just say what Paul is identifying when he says the powers that crucified our Lord in his first letter to Corinthians. He's referring to the Jewish temple leadership structures and that institution. And the temple was a long-standing historical, cultural institution. He's also referring to the institutional presence of an occupying military force of an empire far across the Mediterranean called the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
So that is what he's referring to. But it's also the case, again, from his heritage in the scriptures of Israel, what we call the Old Testament, that the biblical story depicts human institutions and powers as being the mirror side of a reality, a dimension of reality made up of, and we have a difficult time with our language to know, but whether, I mean, the English word demon doesn't get us there anymore, even though that is one of the biblical words used to describe these. But we just, we think of the stuff from the medieval European mythology, little guys with pitchforks.
Imps with horns, yeah.
Yeah, that's not. And so for Paul, he's referring to what we would say are institutional structures, ideologies, and movements that have a real concrete manifestation in how our lives are organized. And so for me to start channeling my money, maybe less towards Amazon and more towards the benevolence fund of my local community of Jesus followers, for him, that's a shift of allegiance in from the powers to the risen Jesus. And that's very clear. That's what he was all about. He was constantly on this fundraising mission for non-Jewish followers of Jesus to raise their money together and then send it to impoverished followers of Jesus who were Jewish in Jerusalem. And for him, this was an act of unity across the boundary lines of the powers. And so it's a good, this isn't like just ethereal.
Well, no, it makes sense of the waking of the powers, because I mean, in the present, I promise you, if you stop spending less money on Amazon Amazon knows it. They can tell you exactly what you're spending
Oh,
less money on.
yeah.
They can tell you the day you stop spending less money, and they can tell Google to start advertising more stuff to you so you can start spending that money with them again.
got
Now,
it.
obviously, we're living in an era that allows that, but by redistributing my wealth, that's not even the right word, by giving my wealth to the benevolence fund at church, by sharing my wealth with, my fellow believers, I am saying to Amazon, you don't have first claim on not just my money, but my heart's allegiances, my heart's deepest desires. These people, they have the first claim. And that's why I'm willing to, siphon off funds away from you over here to these people, again, who have a first claim. And they do because of our shared Messiah, our shared King, our shared allegiance to him.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. I think that is exactly the way Paul was trying to retrain the imagination.